modest neighborhood of a large city, Maria, a 32-year-old black woman, was finishing up dinner preparations for her 6-year-old daughter, Isabella. Maria was known for her kindness and strength, a woman who had faced many challenges in life but had never allowed difficulties to take away her smile or dignity. Isabella, a lively and imaginative child, was playing with her dolls in the living room, eagerly waiting for her mother's food, which was always prepared with great love. Their life was simple, but filled with affection and closeness. Maria did everything in her power to ensure her daughter grew up in a safe and loving environment, even though money was tight. Suddenly, a loud noise interrupted the tranquility of that afternoon. Someone was banging on the door with such force that it made Maria's heart race. When she opened the door, she was shocked to see 2 police officers. Before she could understand what was happening, they handcuffed her and said she was being arrested for the murder of a man Maria had never seen in her life. Isabella, frightened, began to cry, asking what was going on. Maria, unsure of how to explain the situation to her daughter, tried to calm her while being taken away by the police. What was happening? Why were they taking her? These questions swirled in Maria's mind as she was placed in the police car. Maria was taken to the police station, where she was informed that the murdered man, an important businessman in the city, had been found dead on the same street where she lived. The police claimed that all the evidence pointed to Maria as the main suspect, but she knew she was innocent. Desperate, she cried out her innocence, but no one seemed to believe her. Meanwhile, Isabella was taken to the home of their neighbor, Mrs. Tsida, an elderly woman who always looked after the girl whenever Maria needed to work. Mrs. Tsida was also in shock, unable to understand what was happening. That night, Maria remained in custody, trying to comprehend what had happened and how she would prove her innocence. She thought about Isabella, wondering how her daughter was doing and how she would protect the girl from all of this. Fear and anguish filled her heart, but she knew she couldn't let herself be defeated. Little did Maria know that this unexpected arrest was just the beginning of a long and painful journey, full of twists and turns, where her strength and faith would be tested to the limit. The next morning, Maria was transferred to the city's detention center, where she would await trial. News of her arrest spread quickly throughout the neighborhood and the city, causing a mix of shock and suspicion among the residents. Many couldn't believe that Maria, such a dedicated and hard-working woman, could be involved in such a heinous crime. However, the evidence against her seemed irrefutable. Meanwhile, Isabella remained at Mrs. Tsida's house, who tried to comfort her as best she could. The girl repeatedly asked about her mother, not understanding why Maria hadn't come home. Mrs. Tsida, worried, tried to explain the situation gently, but she knew nothing could ease the heart of a child who only wanted to be with her mother. At the police station, Maria's defense attorney, Mr. Enrique, a middle-aged man with a respectable reputation, arrived to interview her. From the start, he made it clear that Maria's situation was complicated. The evidence against her included fingerprints found on the murder weapon and a witness testimony from a neighbor who claimed to have seen her near the crime scene on the night in question. Maria, desperate, insisted on her innocence. She explained to the lawyer that on the night of the murder, she was at home taking care of Isabella and had no idea how her fingerprints ended up on the weapon. Mr. Enrique listened carefully, but he knew convincing a jury would be difficult, especially with such incriminating evidence. As Maria fought to prove her innocence, the prosecutor handling the case, Mr. Carlos, was determined to secure her conviction. To him, the case was clear, and he saw an opportunity to boost his career with this victory. Mr. Carlos wasn't concerned with doubts or the possibility of Maria being innocent. He was focused solely on winning. Days passed, and the trial date was set. Media pressure and public interest in the case grew by the day. Maria, now imprisoned, tried to hold on to hope, knowing that the only thing keeping her strong was the possibility of being reunited with her daughter. However, the fear of being wrongfully convicted tormented her every moment. On the other side, Isabella missed her mother and, despite her young age, sensed that something very serious was happening. She continued to ask Mrs. Tsida questions, but the answers weren't enough to calm her young heart. The nights were long and lonely for the girl, who silently cried, clutching one of the toys her mother had given her. The trial was approaching, and Maria's fate seemed increasingly uncertain. With all eyes on the courtroom, the city awaited the outcome of this case that divided opinions and stirred intense emotions. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, curious onlookers, and residents from Maria's neighborhood were all present to witness the unfolding of the case that had captured everyone's attention. The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy, filled with tension and anticipation. Maria was brought into the courtroom, and as she entered, her eyes filled with tears at the sight of Isabella, sitting in the front row next to Mrs. Tsida. The girl was quiet, holding a small stuffed bear, with a sad and confused expression. Seeing her daughter, there was a blow to Maria, but at the same time, it gave her the strength to face what was coming next. The judge, Mr. Antonio, a man with a serious expression and rigid demeanor, began the trial. Mr. Carlos, the prosecutor, confidently presented the evidence against Maria. He described how Maria's fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, how a neighbor allegedly saw her near the crime scene, and how everything pointed to her having a motive, though still unidentified, to commit the murder. When it was the defense's turn, Mr. Enrique tried to discredit the evidence, questioning the origin of the fingerprints and the credibility of the witness. He argued that Maria was a devoted mother with no criminal record, and that there was no plausible motive for her to commit such a crime. But even he knew these words might not be enough to convince the jury. During the trial, the prosecutor called to the stand the neighbor who claimed to have seen Maria at the crime scene. He was a middle-aged man with a nervous appearance who, during his testimony, insisted that he saw Maria walking down the street that night. Mr. Enrique tried to discredit the testimony, suggesting that the man might be mistaken, but the testimony remained on record, further weighing against Maria. With each day of the trial, Maria felt the weight of the evidence against her accumulating. Time seemed to drag on, and the hope she tried to keep alive seemed to be fading away. Her only concern was Isabella. How was the girl coping with all of this? How could she protect her daughter if she was convicted? Then came the moment when the defense had to present their own arguments and witnesses. Mr. Enrique, in a risky move, decided to call Isabella to the stand to testify. He knew it was a gamble, but he felt that the innocence of the girl could be the only chance for Maria. Isabella was called to the witness stand. The courtroom fell silent, with everyone's eyes fixed on the small child who clutched her stuffed bear tightly as she climbed onto the chair to reach the microphone. Maria watched, her heart breaking, fearing that the situation might be too much for her daughter. Mr. Enrique approached Isabella gently and began asking simple questions. He inquired about her life with her mother, their routine, and what they did together. Isabella responded timidly, her voice soft and innocent, but her words were filled with a pure and sincere love for her mother. Then came the crucial question. Where were Isabella and her mother on the night of the crime? Without hesitation, the girl answered that they were at home, together, playing and then sleeping. Her statement was simple but carried the weight of a child's truth. The courtroom remained silent, everyone absorbing Isabella's words. The judge, who had maintained a stern expression throughout, seemed visibly moved by the girl's testimony. The prosecutor tried to dismiss the testimony, suggesting that a child so young could be confused, but the emotional impact had already been made. Maria watched her daughter, feeling a mix of pride and despair. This little girl was trying to save her, but would it be enough to turn the tide in her favor? After Isabella's testimony, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Judge Antonio called for a recess to consider the girl's statement. During this break, discussions in the courtroom intensified. Some believed that Isabella's testimony was a decisive point in Maria's favor, while others remained convinced of her guilt. Mr. Enrique, now more hopeful, met with Maria in a small, reserved room where they waited for the trial to resume. Maria, with tears in her eyes, hugged the lawyer, thanking him for giving her daughter a chance to speak the truth. However, fear still consumed her. Would a child's word be enough to save her life? Meanwhile, Isabella was with Mrs. Tsida, who held her close, trying to comfort the girl after her testimony. The tension was palpable, and despite her young age, Isabella seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Tsida, who had known Maria since Isabella was a baby, couldn't believe her friend was going through this. She knew Maria was innocent, but she wondered if justice would be served. When the trial resumed, Judge Antonio appeared more thoughtful, analyzing every detail with renewed attention. He allowed the prosecutor to ask further questions to the key witness in the case, the neighbor who claimed to have seen Maria. Under pressure, the man began to show signs of nervousness, and as he was questioned repeatedly, his version of the events started to show inconsistencies. Mr. Enrique seized the opportunity to exploit these flaws in the testimony. He suggested that the neighbor might be confused about what he saw that night, or even that he could be lying for some reason. The defense argued that there were no conclusive proofs linking Maria to the murder, and that the whole case seemed to be based on assumptions and coincidences. However, what no one expected was the appearance of a new witness. During the recess, an unknown woman, simply dressed, had approached the police, claiming to have crucial information about the case. She was quickly brought to the courtroom and called to testify. This woman, named Rita, was a homeless person who often frequented the area where the crime had occurred. She revealed that on the night of the murder, she had seen a suspicious man loitering around and later fleeing the scene hurriedly. She stated that this man looked nothing like Maria and that he was carrying something in his hands, possibly the murder weapon. Rita explained that she had been afraid to speak up before because she thought no one would believe her due to her circumstances. However, upon seeing news of the trial and realizing that an innocent woman might be convicted, she decided to risk everything and tell the truth. Her statement shed new light on the case, casting doubt on Maria's guilt. The courtroom was abuzz with murmurs of surprise. Mr. Carlos, the prosecutor, seemed disturbed by the unexpected turn of events, but he couldn't ignore Rita's testimony. Mr. Enrique saw this as a golden opportunity to change the course of the trial. Judge Antonio, visibly impacted by the new information, decided that it was necessary to deepen the investigation into this new witness and the man she described. He ordered the police to reopen the investigation, temporarily suspended the trial, and instructed that Maria be kept in custody, but without a final verdict until everything was clarified. Maria, who had nearly lost all hope, saw a light at the end of the tunnel. The possibility that the truth would finally come to light filled her with renewed hope. However, the fight was far from over, and many questions remained unanswered. With the trial suspended, the investigation into the man described by Rita intensified. The police began re-examining all previous evidence and testimonies, this time with a new perspective. Mr. Enrique, determined to prove Maria's innocence, worked tirelessly alongside the investigators, reviewing every detail of the case. During the investigation, the police discovered that the man described by Rita had been seen on other occasions near the neighborhood, but had always managed to elude the authorities. He was an individual with a history of minor crimes, but had never been caught for something as serious as murder. This raised suspicion that he might be involved in something bigger, possibly working for someone more powerful. At the same time, Mr. Enrique began looking into the past of the victim, the businessman whose murder Maria was accused of. He found out that the man was involved in shady deals, including dealings with loan sharks and criminal groups operating in the city. This new information suggested that the murder might have been a hit, not a crime of passion or revenge as initially suspected. More people started to come forward, offering clues that linked the murdered businessman to influential figures in the city. One of these figures was Marcos, a well-known businessman who had significant influence in the underworld but maintained a facade of respectability. He was someone many feared, but few dared to confront. Rita, the key witness, revealed that she had seen the suspect meeting with Marcos days before the murder. This detail suggested that the true culprit might be protected by someone powerful, someone who could manipulate the investigation and divert attention to Maria, a woman without resources and easy to blame. Mr. Enrique, realizing the gravity of this new information, presented it to Judge Antonio. The judge, who had shown signs of doubt about Maria's guilt from the beginning, decided it was time to call Marcos to testify. This decision was met with shock and fear by the community, as everyone knew that confronting Marcos meant risking their lives. Marcos, when summoned, maintained an arrogant and confident posture. In the courtroom, he denied any involvement with the crime or the man described by Rita. However, his composure began to crumble when Mr. Enrique presented evidence that the murdered businessman had been in negotiations with him shortly before the murder. This connected Marcos to the crime in an undeniable way. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak when Rita was called again to testify, this time face-to-face with Marcos. The confrontation between the two was electrifying. Rita, initially intimidated by Marcos's presence, now showed determination to tell the whole truth. She described in detail the suspicious meetings and how she believed that the man who committed the crime was acting on Marcos's orders. Rita's testimony, along with the evidence presented by Mr. Enrique, began to turn the tide. Judge Antonio, recognizing the seriousness of these new revelations, began questioning the integrity of the initial investigation and the possibility that Maria had been used as a scapegoat. However, the story was far from over. Many questions remained. Who was the real killer? What was the actual motive behind the crime? And most importantly, how had Maria, an ordinary woman, become entangled in such a dangerous game? These questions began to unravel, But the climax of the story was yet to come, with secrets that no one could have predicted. As the situation became increasingly complex, the pressure surrounding the case grew. The media was in a frenzy, and the public was divided between those who still believed in Maria's guilt and those who started questioning everything that had been presented so far. Judge Antonio was determined to get to the bottom of this story, even if it meant confronting powerful forces. Marcos, who had maintained an air of control and confidence, began to show signs of nervousness. The incisive questions from Mr. Enrique, combined with Rita's testimony, backed him into a corner. He knew the situation was slipping out of his control, and his influence, which once seemed unshakable, began to weaken. Meanwhile, in prison, Maria anxiously awaited news. With each visit from Mr. Enrique, she clung to the hope that the truth would finally come out. She knew she had no chance of facing the forces behind this scheme alone, but she felt that something was about to happen. As the investigation progressed, new evidence began to emerge. The police managed to track down the man described by Rita, who was hiding in a distant neighborhood. When captured, he revealed that he had been paid to commit the crime and that Maria's fingerprints were planted on the weapon after the murder to frame her. He confirmed that Marcos was behind everything and that the order to eliminate the murdered businessman was due to a dispute over territory and illegal businesses. This confession was devastating for Marcos, but he still had one last trick up his sleeve. During his testimony in court, he insinuated that Maria had an unknown connection with the murdered businessman. This insinuation cast a new shadow of doubt over the case. What could possibly link Maria, a simple woman with no involvement in the underworld, to a corrupt and influential businessman? Mr. Enrique, now aware that something more was at play, began to dig deeper into Maria's past. He discovered that years ago, Maria had worked as a housekeeper for a wealthy man, but she never talked much about it. Determined to understand this part of her life better, he tracked down old colleagues and friends of Maria. It was then that a surprising revelation came to light. The murdered businessman, whose death Maria was accused of, was the man she had worked for years ago. At the time, Maria was young and struggling, but she had fallen in love with a man who also worked in the house, a chauffeur who was treated with disdain by their employers. This man was Isabella's father. Maria, knowing that their relationship wouldn't be accepted, left the job and moved on with her life. But the businessman never accepted Maria's rejection, and after Isabella was born, he began threatening her, demanding that she keep quiet about the child's paternity, fearing a scandal that could ruin his reputation. To protect her daughter, Maria kept this part of her life a secret until it all culminated in the murder. When this truth was revealed, the courtroom was in shock. The connection between Maria and the murdered businessman explained why she had been targeted as a scapegoat. Marcos had used this connection to manipulate the situation, knowing that Maria's story could be used against her. However, the revelation of Isabella's true paternity changed the course of the trial. Mr. Enrique, now armed with this new information, argued that Maria was as much a victim as the murdered businessman, used and manipulated by powerful men. He asked the court to reconsider all the evidence in light of this new revelation. Judge Antonio, visibly shaken by the complexity of the case, once again suspended the trial to review all the new evidence and testimonies. Maria's fate was still undecided, but now, the truth was finally beginning to emerge. With the new revelations, Maria's defense gained momentum. The connection between the murdered businessman and Maria became clear, and Marcos's manipulation was evident. The court began to see Maria as a victim of circumstance, and the investigation shifted its focus to Marcos and his accomplices. Marcos, feeling cornered, tried to intimidate witnesses and bribe officials, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Mr. Enrique pushed for a deeper investigation, revealing a network of corruption and crimes involving several influential figures in the city. The situation became unsustainable for Marcos, who started losing his allies. Realizing that his empire was crumbling, Marcos attempted to flee the city, but he was captured before he could escape. In desperation, he confessed to all the crimes, including the murder of the businessman, and revealed that he had intended to frame Maria from the start to divert suspicion from himself. His confession was the final blow that destroyed the case against Maria. With Marcos's confession and the truth finally exposed, Judge Antonio had no choice but to declare Maria innocent. She was released, and the case was closed with the arrest of Marcos and his accomplices. The city, which once doubted Maria, now sympathized with her story, recognizing how much she had suffered unjustly. Maria left the courtroom to applause and tears of joy. The woman who had been unjustly accused and nearly destroyed by the system was finally free. Isabella, who had been waiting anxiously outside with Mrs. Tsida, ran into her mother's arms as soon as she saw her, holding her tightly. The embrace between mother and daughter was a moment of pure emotion, a symbol of the strength and love that had sustained them through their ordeal. The days that followed were a time of adjustment for Maria and Isabella. The home where they lived was filled with flowers and messages of support left by neighbors, who once suspected Maria but now saw her as a hero, someone who had survived a corrupt and relentless system. Mrs. Tsida, who had always been by their side, became an even more important figure in both of their lives, helping them rebuild their routine and adjust to their new reality. Maria decided that she didn't want to just move on. She wanted to turn her experience into something positive for others. She began attending support groups for victims of injustice and working with human rights organizations in the city, sharing her story and fighting to ensure that no one else would go through what she had. Her voice, once silenced by fear, was now a powerful tool for change. Isabella, although still young, was also deeply affected by everything that had happened. The girl, who had once been forced to testify in court, grew up with an early understanding of justice and courage. Over time, she excelled in school and became involved in community support activities, always proud of her mother's strength and determined to do what was right. The bond between mother and daughter grew even stronger after everything they had faced together. Maria, always concerned with protecting Isabella, realized that despite her young age, her daughter was a source of strength and inspiration. They began making plans for the future, with Maria encouraging Isabella to pursue her dreams and stand up for what she believed in. Meanwhile, the impact of Maria's case reverberated throughout the city. Marcos's arrest and the collapse of his corruption network led to a wave of changes in the judicial system and local administration. Authorities who had ignored or participated in the manipulation of evidence were investigated, and new measures were implemented to ensure that similar cases wouldn't happen again. Maria's story became a symbol of resilience and justice. Books were written and documentaries were produced, telling her journey of suffering, struggle, and eventual victory. She was invited to speak at conferences and events, where her story inspired people to fight for their rights and believe that the truth would always prevail. Finally, Maria and Isabella found peace. The pain of the past still existed, but it had been transformed into a driving force for a better future. They continued living in their community, surrounded by friends and supporters, and began a new chapter of their lives, marked not by the shadow of injustice, but by the light of hope and love. Thus, the new beginning for Maria and Isabella was not just the end of a battle. It was the start of a life lived fully, with the certainty that together they could face any challenge the future might bring.